You're back.
I'm back.
Well done, mate. Good to
Good.
see you.
No, thank you so much as well for taking the time out to actually do this, because obviously, yeah, we posted a reel on Instagram about the Cootamundra Wattle, right?
Great.
If I find it, I'll show you what it is. I'll just show you. It's just basically like, hey, here's a wattle that you can grow in your garden, right?
Yes, I remember this.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the comments, I'll read them to you right now. So some of them are, guys, Acacia baileyana is considered an environmental weed in Victoria and the ACT. And while not a noxious weed, it spreads into our bushland and it outcompetes our Indigenous wattles, you know, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, basically just lots and lots of people, like lots of people just commenting that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I've done some digging into it as well. What I've found is that there's a few sort of articles posted about the Cootamundra wattle, and I think that's where a lot of this has come from. And so this wattle in particular is the one that's getting a lot of hate, right?
Yeah.
And when we think about acacia species globally, right, you've got them in South America, in Africa, and they're completely invasive and obviously destroying lots of environments there. But, you know, bringing that back here in Australia, it's kind of interesting to see what happens when we move our own acacias around. And so does that mean that we can only be growing and harvesting in particular regions, right? So that's sort of, I guess, like the baseline of the discussion today. I've sent you through some questions too. So I guess just like question number one is if you could just maybe give you like a little bit of like a background in terms of who you are, what you're doing, why wattle seed, all that sort of stuff.
Great. Thanks, Hayden. So yeah, my name is Angus Jones, or Gus. I hail from the Barossa Valley, Lower Barossa Valley in South Australia. And for the last 18 years, it's mainly the last 6 years, I've had a full focus on edible acacias, Australian acacias. But yeah, my, I suppose, engagement with edible acacias in Australia dates back to 2004, where I was working with traditional owners in the George Gill Ranges on Luritja country. In working with a lot of cultural tourism, and we're using edible acacias as a way of education, as an education tool to get tourists to connect to country and to see the different uses of both medicinally and for tools and shelter and narcotics, and also for edible seed. And I realized that these edible acacias had a huge, I suppose, use historically and culturally, but also a massive use in Australia's landscape from Cape York all the way down to Tasmania. And we're very diverse. You know, our largest group of or genus of flowering plants in Australia, about 1,000 different acacias. So I thought, wow, this is something I really want to focus on, and there's huge scope for learning and engagement and cultural connection. So yeah, 2018, Wattle We was formed. Wattle We Eat. I primarily focus on wholesale of edible acacias to the Australian market, a little bit of export too, and I wild harvest. So yeah, wild harvest, grow edible acacias, doing some horticultural trials on my property in the Mid-Murray, South Australia, but also engaging as an industry leader in the space, engaging other farmers, other growers, other wild harvesters, and leading a national program funded by AgriFutures Australia and delivered by ANFAB to try and accelerate the wattle seed industry in Australia, to get other participants involved and and grow this medical industry. So yeah, that's pretty much in a nutshell what I do, and it's a pretty challenging but very rewarding space, as you know.
Yeah,
totally.
To be. Yeah, I mean, we've worked together for like, you know, since I pretty much started out, which is, you know, about 2 and a bit years ago, almost 3 years now, right? And obviously, like, we both share this passion, not only just for like wattle seeds, but, you know, native foods in general. But kind of like what I want to get out of this and try to understand a bit more is like, why do you think, in your opinion, like wattle is like an important food crop?
A couple of reasons. The number one is that it's a perennial tree or shrub. Okay, so it means that it's you know, they are short-lived, but being perennial, once they're established after either planted or after fire or flood, or, you know, favorable seasonal conditions, they are there in the landscape. They're a pioneering species, so you'll see them. They're the first emergence after a fire or flood, or land is cleared, and you know, you'll find them from, as I said before, all over the country, okay, from Cape York all the way down south. Every state and territory in Australia has acacias, and they're now forming a really important role in landscape restoration, and have a real niche within regenerative agriculture to try and rehabilitate degraded landscapes. They're very fast growing. Another reason why they're, I suppose, so used as a food crop is that they're high yielding. So very quickly, we're getting quite high yields off the trees. And yeah, it's a very nutritious seed that's really good for health, and with a food shortage looming, a really good way to secure that food security for the future. So many reasons why we're kind of focusing on them as a past, present, and future food crop.
Interesting. So like, I guess it makes a lot of sense, right? It comes from this country, like we should be using it, right? But then when it comes into sort of like even the growing of it, like what sort of like water inputs are going into it compared to maybe like a wheat crop, for example? Is it a similar water amount? Is it more like, even like what about like chemical inputs like fertilizers?
Well, it's a really good question, Hayden. And I suppose the advantage over a perennial legume such as acacia, as opposed to an annual crop such as wheat, barley, canola, all our kind of common, crops in Australia, is that these perennial legumes are extremely deep rooted. So they're drought and climatic adapted to deal with these extremes that we face, these extreme temperatures and droughts and floods and everything that we face in Australian climate. So they are so well adapted, climatically adapted. So being deep rooted, I've seen areas that have been either washed away with flood, or I've also seen areas on mine sites that have been dug away, and I've seen roots of these acacias. One of them that comes to mind is Acacia victoriae, the elegant bramble wattle, and amongst lots of other common names, but very widespread acacia species. And some of the roots, it might be a 2 to kind of 6 meter tree, in various forms and shapes. But some of the root systems that I've seen are double the height of the tree, so 12, 15 meters down, reaching into that subterranean aquifers and water courses, so enabling them to survive during the hotter, drier months. So that's really crucial in terms of being able to survive with these such varied seasons, as opposed to wheat, barley, those things. But also that the inputs that we need to grow these edible acacias are extremely low, because they do have a symbiotic relationship with a rhizobium that attaches to the roots, as we've talked about previously, and they actually fixate nitrogen from the atmosphere, and are basically fertilizing the landscape, increasing the fertility of the soil naturally in a natural process, which is fantastic, to be using those types of crops in our landscape, as opposed to using nitrogen-based fertilizers that, as we know, recently have almost gone up tenfold in price because of transport and everything that's happening globally in the economy. But also, nitrogen-based fertilizers are responsible for about 1.5% of our world's energy production. So that's, even though it only sounds a little bit, 1.5%, that's a huge impact that's having globally on our environment, to produce those nitrogen-based fertilizers, when we can use both annual and perennial legume crops to actually, naturally fertilize and improve our degraded soils here in Australia. So they have a host of, I suppose, roles to play in our landscape, and it's a really exciting space.
Yeah, no, totally. No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? They've literally spent like millions of years evolving the landscape, right? So, why aren't we harvesting and growing it, right? But I mean, you mentioned before about like there being like 1,000 acacia species. We were talking about like the Cootamundra wattle in particular. So like with that sort of thing, right, there are some challenges, I guess, that you might be facing as well, and other people who are maybe growing their own wattle seeds, right? How is that going in terms of like, what's your opinion? Do you think that, we shouldn't be moving acacia species around, or should we, what should we do?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, inherently, cultures all around the world. We are part of the environment. We are part of the landscape, and we have traded and moved seeds and grains and nuts and fruits all around the world as a natural process of survival. So, yeah, we do have to be obviously careful with some of the invasive species that they're not going to invade, sensitive bushland areas. But Cootamundra wattle, for example, yeah, that's one that hails from near Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, from the township of Cootamundra. But if you look at a map of Australia, it's actually in that catchment of the Murray-Darling Basin, and it wouldn't take long, being a high seeded variant in a wet year, that could easily get into that watershed, into those water courses. And you think about where it's gone along, into kind of Canberra, Victoria, South Australia, where it's actually moved through country, probably not only by birds and insects, but also by water courses. So it has now naturalised in pretty much every state and territory in Australia, except for Northern Territory and Tassie. So you find it east to west, north to south. And it's also been used as a favoured ornamental plant. I suppose you see it everywhere you go, because it is beautiful, has beautiful foliage. It makes an amazing shade tree. So, gardens all around, landscapes, councils have used them because they are such a pretty tree. So in terms of their invasiveness, there are currently plantations of Acacia baileyana, Cootamundra wattle, in both South Australia and Victoria that have been going on for probably the last 6 or so years in quite close proximity to other farmland and bushland. And they haven't, and this is in quite, bear in mind, it's I suppose what you'd call a southern temperate type of rainfall, climatically adapted species. So it's around that 500 to 800 mil rainfall. I'm growing them in much less rainfall just to see how they go. But there haven't been any escapees into bushland from those plantations or from those seed production areas, which is very encouraging. Obviously, in high density with high seed yielding species, you'd think there could be risk, and there can be, but it comes down to managing your landscape, managing those plantations. And I mean, people don't blink an eye when it comes to planting an olive plantation, say next to a reserve or a conservation or national park, and yet they have extreme potential invasiveness. So I'm not sure if that's completely answered your question, but we don't have to be too concerned with baileyana. I mean, some records show that it's a short-lived tree, but from my observations and others, it actually can live longer than 12 to 15 years. I've seen some areas that are probably, some trees that have probably been around for over 30 years. But I suppose because the way that we also manage our landscapes now are very different to when First Nations were managing Australia's landscape, and obviously with urbanisation and things like that, the landscape's no longer being burnt like it was in those built up areas, and that they do respond extremely aggressively from fire, these edible acacias. So that's probably one reason why we're not seeing them being as invasive as they potentially could be. And then obviously as you go more semi-arid and arid zone, a lot of these species, if the seed was to get there, it's simply too dry for them to. They might germinate, but then there's little chance of survival. I suppose one thing that has been brought to our attention as an industry is that could be a potential issue is changing, I suppose, the genetic pool of those acacias by hybridizing things like Acacia baileyana with a local stand of Acacia decurrens, for example. So that kind of hybridizing can occur if you're bringing in species to another area, and then that can change, I suppose, that the ecology of that area. So that's something that we have to be mindful of as as growers and of traders of wattle seed. Yeah.
Totally, yeah. Because I mean, last time we spoke about this as well, you were talking about how the Cootamundra wattle, it doesn't have suckers as well. So, you know, the way for the seed to spread could be, you know, through some sort of like bird or something, or maybe even like the wind pushing it or something. But that's also something that's also interesting to note, because of a lot of acacia species, that's sort of what makes them so invasive too. But I guess that's something that, you know, with the Cootamundra wattle, that's probably why that's not happening too. And like you mentioned about the fires, but you mentioned an entrance, like a really interesting comparison when it comes to like an olive tree, right? So here in Victoria, we have huge issues with like blackberries, right? Where they're completely invasive in lots of like eucalypt woodlands, right? And it's causing, you know, huge amounts of damage and, you know, lots of money spent having to clear them all out. But at the same time, does that mean that we shouldn't have, you know, blackberries growing in Australia? You know, because birds love to eat them, and those seeds, once they go down that digestive tract and that bird takes a poop in, you know, a bushland area, you know, it's that same sort of thing, you know? So olive trees, you know, you've got all sorts of different berries and things like that. And these are things that I think we need to be sort of mindful of. And I think with like the Cootamundra wattle, it's something, you know, we definitely need to recognize what is the risk here, but also at the same time, what are we going to lose out on? You know?
True. No, very, very good point with the blackberries. And yeah, it's, you know, risk and reward and, you know, just being more aware of what we're doing, you know, what our actions could potentially bring to the environment, having that awareness of what's in your backyard, what your neighbors are doing, you know, all of those things. And, you know, I was speaking to an ecologist not long ago that's, you know, it's worked for government, that's worked in all kinds of, you know, industry bodies, you know, with regards to land management and primary production. And, you know, we were talking about the you know, the weed debate, and we have had a bit of a, you know, shift in recent times of the role that some of these weeds can play in the landscape. I mean, it's better to have a, you know, a box thorn, which is, you know, was always the, you know, in many districts was the evil box thorn, but you know, it's better than nothing. It's better than if you've got a degraded, you know, landscape with absolute, you know, zero soil fertility, zero biodiversity. If you've got a box thorn there, you look at all the life that's surrounded by that. Okay, it's providing shade, it's reducing erosion, it's providing shelter and habitat for insects, for your reptiles, for birds as a natural you know, barrier against predation. They do play their role in the landscape, and that's, I suppose, those ideologies have changed in recent times of looking at, you know, the benefits, as long as it's not, you know, going to invade, you know, and take over and outcompete, but something is often better than nothing.
So I've got a question then when it comes into sort of like using different like acacias from where they're from, right? So let's say if we're talking about, you know, something like a coastal region, shouldn't there be, you know, like a coastal wattle being grown instead of a Baileyana? So why would we be growing like a Cootamundra wattle outside of its natural range when there are other acacia species that could be grown there that are local?
Yeah, good question. Well, ideally, you know, you do choose local provenance seed because A, it's going to grow better, and it's often available, and B, yeah, it is, you know, in sync with those natural environmental processes, having, you know, choose local plants to your area that are meant to be there. But you know, I mean, depends. Some of the purists will say, you know, not to grow natives outside of their natural range, but at the end of the day, we live in a country where there's nurseries everywhere, there's availability to tube stock, and as we said before, having something in the landscape is often better than a landscape devoid of color and vibrancy and pollen and richness. So yeah, always try and grow your local species, but yeah, better than an introduced or an exotic species, which we still, you know, seem to be okay with. People don't I suppose laugh or quaff at having, you know, aloe vera or something in their backyard, which can, you know, and agaves and things, because they seem accepted, they're naturalized, they've been around for long enough, but they, you know, Australian natives sometimes get a bit of a hard time amongst the purists.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's important to raise it because I think the best point is like just comparing it. Like even like prickly pear, for example, right? I like, you know, it's a very common garden plant here in Melbourne. Like, you know, lots of people grow it, especially because we had so much migration here. You know, this is like a very featured plant, but you know, the prickly pear is like very, very invasive, right? Especially how dry it is too, and it can tolerate these really like, you know, crazy environments because that's what it's evolved to do, right? So I don't know, I think it's just very interesting to sort of just think about those comparisons and to think like, okay, well, what are we going to lose out with, and you know, what are we already doing as well, because we are in a globalized world too, and trying to sort of be very traditional and protective of things, I guess it limits our ability to grow and change, because you know, we are in the driest continent, but yet we're growing fields of wheat, right, which require huge amounts of inputs. You know, when we're talking from the perspective of sustainability, why aren't we growing things that have literally evolved here? Yeah, sure, that, you know, there's going to be some chance of invasiveness and things like that, but at the end of the day, that's the way the world is heading, and we've already done that with so many different species, and it's not like it's going to cause huge ecological disasters like, you know, the introduction of like rabbits or foxes, right? It's just going to be more of a nuisance or like a weed sort of thing, but at the same time, it's going to be supporting biodiversity. So, you know, I think it's really interesting. Is there anything else you think you'd like to add to sort of the topic?
Eat more native foods, grow more native plants, you know, create more, you know, whether it be on farm biodiversity or in backyard biodiversity by, you know, supporting your local nurseries and your land care groups, and engaging with your neighbours, and you know, trading and swapping cultivars and plants and veggies, and create an abundance in your backyard or your nature strip, or work with your councils, your local land care groups to try and, you know, green up this continent, because we all know the benefits of both socially, environmentally, and culturally of actually, you know, engaging in those activities, and how bloody healthy it is, how good it is being out in your backyard and just being able to eat something that you've grown, or pick a flower that you've grown, or that you've traded, or, you know, giving your partner a nice little gift, or your friends or your family some excess produce. That's living, you know.
Yeah. No. Awesome.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much.
This is a Wattle seed brew that is my grandmother's, my late grandmother's enamel mug. I'm actually having a Acacia, Baileana, or Cootamundra Wattle now, with a bit of local honey and a bit of local milk. And I'll tell you what, it's beautiful, chocolatey hazelnut richness. So yeah, a lot better than, you know, trying to get caffeine or coffee that may have been grown unsustainably, unethically from the other side of the world. This is growing in our backyard. So,
but I do need to head off anyway.
Awesome, mate. Great to chat, Hayden.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot, Gus, and thank you so much for your time.
Always good to chat. See you, mate.
Awesome. See ya. Bye.
See you, chat. Bye.